Hi, I'm Paul. Welcome back to another Blazor build. Today we'll build an accessible copy to clipboard button. I did build a version of this at the start of December, which originally was just using an icon button that required a tooltip. And although I had a tooltip component that I had built some years ago, I thought I'd best reevaluate it, which then led to the previous video on building a tooltip component. That process and another trip down the rabbit hole that is web accessibility led me to both learn new things and reevaluate others, and as such the clipboard button is no longer just an icon button with a tooltip. Just like development, accessibility is a continual learning process, and one thing that I had not really considered were users of speech recognition software. And although I believe there are some common icons that can be used without the user having to guess or have the assistive software overlay control numbers, why be potentially exclusive when you can be more inclusive with minor changes? So I hope you like the result of this bout of research. On screen there are 3 copy to clipboard buttons, and as you can see they all use the same copy icon. However, they also have text which forms the button's accessible name, so the playing field is the same for all users. The component has numerous parameters, with a lot of the defaults being adequate. As such, I will only demonstrate and discuss the more important of these, with others mentioned during the review of the code. This video should help you to comfortably build your own accessible copy to clipboard component. But as always, the code can be freely downloaded from GitHub for reference or alteration as you see fit. The link to the source code is in the video description below. Before I start the demo, there are a couple of things I need to mention. Copying text to the clipboard is usually instant, and excluding any browser security issues, difficult to show exceptions or delays. Due to this, I have added a couple of lines of code that checks the start of the text to be copied, and if the text starts with the word wait, the code will add a task delay of 4 seconds, with the word fail raising an empty system exception. These are still in the source code but commented out. The first button has its copy button text parameter set to copy notes, with its clipboard text parameter, the text for the copy process, assigned to the same variable bound to the text area which is currently empty. This text area variable uses the bind event of onInput, so the component will be updated on every character change. When the clipboard text parameter is set to null or empty, or the component has its disabled parameter set to true, like the button towards the bottom of the page, the component will set the area disabled attribute to true and add the appropriate styling. I do not use the HTML disabled attribute, as this causes focusable elements to be excluded from the tab key navigation. The minimum width of the first button was set via a component parameter to use 16 rem. The copy URL button was set to use 12 rem, with the copy all button using the default of 0, meaning it will be the minimum size needed to display all of its content, growing if necessary with text changes. All the buttons can get bigger, but will not get smaller than the minimum width of their content. Let's turn on NVDA, the free screen reader, and tab to the first button.
Speech mode beeps. Speech mode talk. Notes, edit multi-line blank. Copy notes button unavailable, nothing to copy.
It tells us that the copy notes button is unavailable, but also why it's unavailable. This was due to using the area described by attribute linked to hidden text assigned via a component parameter. I will go into more detail regarding this when we review the code. I will use Shift Tab to go back to the notes field and add some text.
Notes, edit multi-line blank. T-E-S-T.
I'll tab to the copy notes button and press enter.
Copy notes button. Copied notes successfully.
After the enter key was pressed, almost immediately the screen reader announced copied notes successfully, another component parameter value. You probably missed it, but the button's text changed along with an icon before you got the green tick indicating success for sighted users. The component, as well as being functional, is also an insight into differing ways in which you can provide users with feedback about their actions. You may have watched my other video on building a busy indicator. That component announced loading as soon as the button was clicked and then loaded once complete. But this component did not announce copying when it was clicked, although that is a parameter option. I am in two minds about the use of an initial announcement, as although I like an initial announcement, I also know how annoying listening to lots of screen reader announcements can be. The component parameter allows this decision to be on a case-by-case basis. One or two components on the site, then it's probably okay. Two or three on the same page, probably annoying. I will let you decide. I'll clear the clipboard result text and go back to the notes field so I can type the word wait.
URL, edit, select, copy URL button. Clear result button. Copy URL, copy notes, edit multi-line text. TSET. WIT.
I will tab to the copy notes button and press enter, but after a couple of seconds I'll press it again twice in succession.
Copy notes button. Copying. Copying. Copied notes successfully.
Visually, we could see the button's text change to copying, along with a clock icon appearing to the right. But after a couple of seconds, each time I pressed the enter key, the screen reader announced copying. The user could press the enter or space key any number of times, but while the process was still not complete, they would be advised that it's copying, receiving the completed announcement once it was complete. For the copying announcement, I skimped a bit as I utilised the button's text for the message to save adding another parameter. It's extremely unlikely that there will ever be a delay of more than a few milliseconds in which the user would want feedback, plus the button's text, such as copying, seemed adequate. You can easily add another parameter if need be. Although we are probably discussing a corner case, given the button's text as shown is also its accessible name, perhaps we should have used the text copying notes in case the user tabbed away and back again during the process. I will now navigate back to the notes field and type the word fail so we can cause an exception.
Notes, edit multi-line wait. TIW FIL. Copy notes button. Copying notes failed. Please try again.
Visually, the button's text changed to retry copy notes, along with an icon indicating failure. The icons also have component parameters with the defaults currently in use. This time the screen reader announced copying notes failed, please try again. And as the button's accessible name changed, if the user navigated away and back again without making any changes to the notes field, the screen reader would announce retry copy notes button to inform the user that they have not yet copied this field. We could have used an area label so the button's accessible name was always copy notes, with the button's text just being used for sighted users, as we have an area described by attribute for additional information for screen readers. Had we have done this though, a user using voice assisted technologies would most likely have said retry copy notes to try again, which would not have worked given the button's accessible name via the area label would still be set to copy notes. The safest path may have been not to change the button's text, the accessible name, and then to have both an on-screen and audible message. However, the point of this video was to show other techniques that may be better suited to your requirements but still remain accessible. In this instance, although we changed the button's text, the button still works for all users as the visible text matches its accessible name. Let's move on to the next button. I will tab to the URL field and then tab again to get to the copy URL button.
URL, copy URL, clear result button. Copy URL button.
The screen reader announced copy URL button. Before I press enter for this button, I have set the component's signal start parameter to true, so on pressing the enter key, the user should get instant feedback.
Copying. Copied URL to clipboard successfully.
I pressed the enter key and this time the screen reader announced copying, and then on completion announced copy URL to clipboard successfully. You may have noticed text getting printed to the screen where it says clipboard event. The component raises an on-text copied event that fires for both success or failure. I added this primarily in case of failures, so you could grab any exception and log it if need be. For those wondering about the addition of an onCopy requested event, which may be used to first fetch the data to be copied, this is problematic due to time-sensitive browser security mechanisms, and as such I would not recommend this, as depending on the time taken to get the data, the browser may flag this as suspicious and block clipboard write access. It's safer to use a two-step approach. For example, you could initiate a data request and then once ready, enable the button for the copy process, as the last button will simulate. But just so you know, we are copying text to the clipboard. On the way to the toggle copy all button, I will use Ctrl V inside the paste from clipboard field so we can see the last item copied to the clipboard.
Clear result button. Paste from clipboard, just using Ctrl plus V edit multi-line blank. Toggle copy all button. Copy all button unavailable pending form completion. Toggle copy all button. Copy all button. Copied successfully.
I landed on the toggle copy all button and tabbed to the grayed out copy all button, with the screen reader announcing copy all button unavailable pending form completion, a message that was assigned to the button's unavailable message parameter with its disabled parameter being set to true. Pressing toggle copy all enables the copy all button as long as the clipboard text parameter has text, otherwise the control would still look disabled. This could just as easily be done in code, updating the disabled parameter when the text was available. Pressing the enter key whilst on the copy all button causes the screen reader to announce copied successfully on completion, without a copying message, as the signal start parameter for this button was set to false. I am trying not to delve too deep into the complexities of accessibility, but it's important to note that during the demo I used the tab key to navigate. A screen reader user has many other ways to navigate a page, but any that jumped directly to the button would react the same, i.e. the user would receive the same announcements. Using what they call the virtual cursor with the arrow keys is somewhat different. When using the arrow keys, page content can be read line by line or character by character, and there are many nuances between the combinations of existive technologies, browsers and operating systems. You really do need to fire up a screen reader and listen to what it sees. The demo used two different mechanisms to have content announced to the user. The simplest and most uniform across the aforementioned combinations of technologies was the use of the role attribute with a value of status, which is equivalent to the ARIA live attribute with a value of polite. To put this in plain English, albeit simplified, both attributes create what they call a live region, and assistive technologies will monitor live regions and announce changes. Emphasis on changes. More on that when we look at the code. I use this for the messages such as copying, copied successfully, copying failed, please try again, etc. The second technique used in the demo was with the use of the ARIA described by attribute, and this is where there are many nuances, as you can combine this with ARIA hidden, which is counterintuitive as the ARIA hidden attribute is meant to hide things from assistive technologies. The ARIA described by attribute allows you to associate a description to an item to give it more context, and I used this attribute on the buttons when they were unavailable, so I could give the user a reason as to why the button was not available for use. So far so good, however things can appear completely different when using the virtual cursor. Depending on the screen reader used, it may or may not read the description linked to the item when using the arrow keys, instead reading it separately when encountered, which means you have two separate unlinked announcements which may be confusing for the user. I did experiment with other techniques, with the most promising being the newer area description attribute, but that had quirks and was less supported than the area described by attribute. I eventually settled on using the area described by attribute, but with the addition of the area hidden attribute as to hide this from the virtual cursor. So although the virtual cursor does not read the description when reading our button like the other navigation methods, I found this much less confusing than having the description read out in any order depending on the direction of travel using the arrow keys. If you do not agree with this decision, you can easily just remove the area hidden attribute. That's it for the demo. Time to look at the project and code, starting with the components on the home page. There is not much to discuss as we will go through all of the parameters when looking at the C# code. The only thing to note is the use of the bind event on lines 9 and 18 to change the default binding from onChange to onInput, so the variable bound to the event used for our component parameter is updated per keystroke instead of just on lost focus. I should point out that my experience is with Blazor WebAssembly, so although I have used onInput for the demo as I predominantly use this binding within my apps, I have not tested the performance of this binding with Blazor Server. Talking of Blazor Server, that leads us to the solutions projects that can be seen on the right hand side of the screen. For YouTube videos, I predominantly use the Blazor web app template, selecting the interactive server option with the location of global for simplicity, but you can use any interactive project type. I also use the same names and settings in each build, so it's easy to copy and paste things between projects and easier for you to follow along if you watch more than one of my videos, as lots of things will just become familiar. After the creation of the Blazor Server project, I then added a Razor library project called blazorbuilds.components for our toClipboard component. I then added a reference to the component project for the server project, as well as a link to the CSS style sheet in the app.razor file, and updated the imports razor file on both projects for any code references. There is no TypeScript or JavaScript files, so the only additional configuration is for the setup of the CSS preprocessor to generate the CSS. I made a short 4-minute video about the extension and setup that I use in all of my videos. The link to that is in the video description below. Regarding CSS, I have not looked too closely at the new CSS nesting model, but so far I have not seen anything that makes me want to jump ship and stop using Sassy CSS. Plus it would be incredibly tedious trying to create a CSS framework only using native CSS. Take a quick look at my Build Your Own CSS Framework video to get a better understanding of why I still use Sassy CSS. The link to that is also in the video description below. Okay, I have my usual assets folder with the CSS subfolder in the web root for the generated CSS file, and a corresponding assets folder and SCSS subfolder for the Sassy CSS files. Within the SCSS folder I have my usual root partial file for global CSS variables, which may seem a little odd as we only have the clipboard component. I do this as these variables are the same ones that I use in my other components and projects, and as such I can move components between projects easily. The SVG icons partial file just contains classes for the SVG icons used within the component. These act as the default icon classes for the component parameters if they are not provided. The toClipboard partial file contains all the CSS for our component, most of which is just to set style for the button and the various states. I used the B.E.M block element modifier naming convention for CSS, and for those not familiar with Sassy CSS, the ampersand just appends the parent selector to the text to create the new selector. I start with a toClipboard class, which is the block part of B.E.M. The ampersand double underscore button when output becomes a B.E.M element with the class name of to-clipboard double underscore button. I also have three other elements: text, icon and screen reader only, with the icon elements having B.E.M modifying classes denoted by the double dash. When output, ampersand double dash success becomes a class named to-clipboard double underscore icon double dash success. The main SCSS file is not a partial file, as denoted by the lack of the leading underscore in its name. This file just includes the partial files that should be part of the generated CSS output, in this case output to a file named main.css within the webroot assets CSS folder. Next we have my usual folders, common, with subfolders named extensions, models and seeds. Within the extensions folder we just have a small helper class, which I keep meaning to complete and package up as a NuGet package, given that I seem to copy and paste or recreate it often. It only contains a few helpers to stop me freaking out at if-then statements and or to negate not being able to use expression body methods that only contain a single if statement. We will see them in use shortly, but just replace their use with if blocks if you dislike my approach. In the models folder I just have a single file called all models, where I would place all the small model classes used. In this instance just one that is used as an event argument. The seeds folder just contains two files, enums and global values. Within the enums file I have two enums, style as, which is part of my theming process, and as such I now add it to all of my components, and the copy status enum, which just helps us to keep track of the copy to clipboard process. Next is the global values file, which only contains any constant values used by our component and a static helper method for my theming process. Now our toClipboard component within the toClipboard folder. Again, for this component build, I decided just to use a single razor file, as there is hardly any markup and 90% of the code is mainly getting parameter values or setting private variables. The markup starts with a div for our B.E.M containing block, the toClipboard class. The data-static attribute is just for my theming scheme. The only interesting attribute is the use of the style attribute, as this is setting a CSS variable with the value from a component parameter that is then used to update the CSS variable responsible for setting the min width property. This was added so we could have a minimum width to try and keep all the buttons the same size if required. They can grow larger than the minimum width, but they will not get smaller than either their content or the minimum width set. Within our div we have a couple of spans, one that holds the content for the area live region, role equals status, the other for dynamic descriptions for when the button is unavailable. I have assigned the span with the role of status a unique ID. Although this is not strictly necessary, I just do this in case it helps to differentiate between multiple live regions on the page. As the other span is the target of the area described by attribute on the button, this should have a unique ID so it can be linked correctly. I also added the counterintuitive area hidden attribute, as already mentioned, to stop it being read with the virtual cursor, i.e. the arrow keys. Both spans use a class to visually hide them from sighted users. The live region message is cleared after use, so it won't get read with the virtual cursor, as you cannot use area hidden with a live region. The actual button is styled using our toClipboard button class and has the type of button to stop it from causing submission issues if placed within a form. The two notable attributes are area disabled, which informs assistive technologies that they should consider it unavailable for use, which is styled to make it look disabled for sighted users. Where possible, prefer the use of the ARIA disabled attribute over the HTML disabled attribute, as the HTML disabled attribute removes the button from the tab sequence. A screen reader user tabbing through a form would miss it unless they switch to use another navigation method. The content of the button, which forms its accessible name, is comprised of 3 spans, 2 of which are hidden from screen readers as they are just for the icons. So its accessible name, the button text, is obtained from the component parameters and are dependent on the copy status. Next, the actual C# code, and as you can see, a big chunk of it is just for the parameters and private fields. The first 2 component parameters also have the editor required attribute on them, which just warns the user that they are required, although I wish it would raise an error instead of just the design time warnings, as I seem to spend a lot of my time writing defensive code for component parameters. The clipboard text parameter is for the text that is to be copied to the clipboard. The rest down to line 34 are for the text displayed on the buttons or messages for the screen readers and CSS classes. They are pretty much self-explanatory. On line 35, the signal start parameter, if set to true, instructs the code to announce the copying message when clicking on the copy button instead of only announcing the copied message on completion. The min-width decimal parameter is the value that we can assign to the CSS variable that is used within the markup inline style for the minimum width of the button. The actual CSS uses the calc function and multiplies this value by 1 rem to convert the value into the CSS rem unit. For this build, I felt this was a better approach than using strings with the unit type or using separate modifying classes. The disable parameter is what we assign to the ARIA disabled attribute if we want to manually set the button to be unavailable until ready. The code automatically does this as well if there is nothing to copy, i.e. the clipboard text parameter is null or empty. The style as parameter is just the enum that I use for my theming scheme, as already mentioned. We then have an event which we can use to notify the parent of the copy and outcome, success or failure, providing any exception that may have occurred that can be logged if necessary. Next are quite a few private fields used for the defaults if no parameter values are supplied. The only notable field is the first one, the enum, that keeps track of the copy process. The onParameters set method is the only lifecycle event that we use for this component, which is called after the parameters have been assigned any values, which could occur any number of times. It should be noted that there is another lifecycle event called setParametersAsync that occurs before the parameters have been assigned their values, but I tend to use the onParameters set method instead. The first 2 lines just check that the button's text and failed text have been assigned, and if the user opted to ignore the warnings, then they will receive an exception. Down to line 71, we just check and or assign default values to the various fields. Line 73 sets the button to its disabled state if the user requested this, or if the clipboard text parameter is null or empty. I prefer to disable the button rather than have an end user click it and wonder why there's no text on the clipboard. Line 74 sets or clears the unavailable message that provides additional information as to why the button is disabled for screen reader users. Line 76 checks if the clipboard text has changed and that we are not currently copying anything, assigning the copy status back to none if both checks are true. Next is the main routine of the component, the copy to clipboard method. Given its asynchronous nature, Blazor's rendering queue mechanics and task delays added to ensure that screen readers announce everything we want, it can be challenging to fully digest the technical process that is occurring within this method. I have added comments currently collapsed to the source code so I can concentrate only on the logical process, as you can peruse this code and comments at your leisure. The first thing we do in the method is to just exit if the button is in a disabled state, as we are using ARIA disabled, not the HTML disabled attribute, which would not have raised the click event. Next, the if block. Although it's possible code could enter this, it's unlikely. I merely added its content as an example to show how you can provide feedback to a screen reader user if they press the button again while the process was still running. In order to get in the if block, the process has to be underway, and if the signal start parameter was set to true, then a status message would have been set and announced to the end user. Given that we want the screen reader to announce the same copying message, if it has been announced, we need to set the message to empty and then re-add it, so the screen reader detects a change and then announces it. On line 99, we just declare a clipboard result variable for use within any part of the code. We then signal that the process is now entering the copying phase, and if the signal start is true, have the screen reader announce this to the end user. The 150 is just a number of milliseconds added to a task delay in the called routine to both cause a yield of control for a render and to ensure the screen reader detects and announces the message before we add another. Within the try-catch block, we call the browser's Clipboard API writeText method to have the clipboard text written to the clipboard. If successful, we assign a passing clipboard result to our variable, set the copy status to copied, and advise the user that the copy process completed successfully. Next, the catch block. As a side note, probably the only time you'll enter this catch block is when stepping through the code, as after a few seconds the browser blocks access to the writeText method due to security concerns. Within the catch block, we assign a failing result along with any exception that occurred, setting the copying status to failed, notifying screen reader users of the failure so they can try again. The clipboard result is then provided via the onTextCopied event. Given render mechanics, if there is no handler, we request a render by invoking status changed. Last, we want to ensure that any unannounced message is read with the final render clearing the message within the DOM. The getButtonText method on line 146 is called from the markup and just returns the text to use for the button based on the status of the copy process. The setAriaStatusText method sets the text that we want announced by the screen reader based on the copy status value. As mentioned, the delay provides a delay for screen readers given the speed of DOM updates and/or to yield control for the underlying render mechanics. The getStatusIcon method is called from the markup and provides the icon based on the copy status value. setCopyStatus method just sets the private field with the current status of the copy operation. Finally, the buildClassList method, which is called from the markup and is used to build the string of any class names. And with that, we are done. I really do not have anything else to say about this build, other than I have more to learn about accessibility and the intricacies of Blazor's rendering mechanics. As usual, the link to the GitHub repository for all of the source code is within the video description below, along with links to any others that may be helpful for you regarding the build. Please feel free to leave good or bad comments, and I will do my best to answer any questions raised. Thanks for watching. Until next time, bye for now.